just to let everyone know, just so you're, aware. So welcome back, everyone who is joining us tonight. I assumed you joined us the first time. Again, if you don't know me, my name is Sari. I'm the Public Programs Director from MOFAD. And of course, I'm here again with Harold McGee, author of Nosedive. So it's really great that we get to have this extra time. We're super grateful to Harold. Maybe I'll let him give like a very quick intro of himself again, if there's anything specifically that you wanted to mention. I'm just really happy we get this second chance. Obviously we had technical difficulties the first time and it was a bummer. And many of you were very understanding and appreciative. MOFAD had never really had anything like that happen before. So, again, we just want all of our programs to feel really meaningful and worth your time and your money. So, I'm very grateful to Harold to donate his time again, once again with us. So Harold, is there anything you want to say, as far as an introduction that I guess didn't get covered or that you want to reiterate from last time?
Well, not really for myself, but I would say that it really was a shame that we couldn't all hear Nadia clearly all the time, because she's brilliant. And so I encourage you, now that you've gotten at least a little taste of her way of looking at things, to look her up on the web. She's got lots and lots of different articles and so on. And she knows an awful lot. And anyway, so we should make sure to hook her up in a more in a better way somehow or other, and get her back, because I would love to have a conversation with her about the stuff that she knows, which is kind of complementary to what I know. I know about the molecules and the science and so on. She knows kind of the history of science and the history of the industry, the flavor and fragrance industry, and how it's come to be what it is, and the influence that it has on our lives. And that's really important too. So anyway, next time.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I really enjoy getting to know Nadia a little bit. She is absolutely brilliant. And, for those of you who got the follow-up email from me, which hopefully is everyone, her website was included. You can read a lot of her work in there. And I'm excited because she does have a book. She doesn't know exactly when it will be out, but we were kind of joking around that when her book comes out, you and her could be back in conversation, but kind of reverse. You could be kind of interviewing her about the book. And I really do hope that we get to do that at some point. And, just like you, she's been a really long time friend and supporter of MOFAD. So we're very lucky to have her in our community. So thank you everyone for sending your questions ahead of time. That was super helpful. And Harold kind of organized them sort of according to topic and theme. And he did a great job with that. So I'm just going to start shooting them out. Harold, you've seen these, but I'm going to read them nonetheless. So, the first question is really just about the experience of writing the book. Someone just wants to hear a little bit more about what that was like, having to craft language to translate experience, for which we have a somewhat limited vocabulary, of course. How was this process different from your past work?
Well, this was a real nosedive for me, in the sense that I had to delve into things that I had no previous experience with. And so the vocabulary for the molecules, I kind of stuck with the standard vocabulary that's used in the technical literature. Although there were some points at which I tried as explicitly as possible to suggest alternatives. For example, it's really not helpful to call the smell of hydrogen sulfide eggy when you're talking about eggs, kind of circular. So that's why I tried to redefine a few things. And actually, in the case of hydrogen sulfide, to show how far back it goes, that in ways that have nothing to do with eggs. So eggs actually smell like something else, rather than everything else smelling like eggs. Anyway, the challenge was learning up all this information about things like, confined animal facilities and perfume and fragrance, and the smell of circuit boards and laptops. That was the challenge, but also the the real fun. I mean, you know, to wonder, does anyone know what the smell is coming out of a computer, and go online and find it? That's really a lot of fun. And by the way, that's really easy to do. I tried to describe this at the end of the book. It's, you just go to Google Scholar, put in a couple of search words, and you'll be amazed what you can find online these days.
Yes, I bet. Okay, so this next category is more about how to experience the book. So how do you envision readers using the book, and then how has the book research changed the way you eat?
Yeah, so the whole idea of the book, and the reason I called it a field guide, is that it's not really meant to be read from page one all the way to the end. It's about all the different things that there are in the world that I could think of anyway, or that I could find information about, and the particular molecules that they emanate and that give them their kind of olfactory identity. And so my idea is for people to, first of all, simply notice smells more, because there's, I hope in the book, uh, enough information to convince you that it's an interesting thing to pay attention to. And then when you're out and about and you do notice something that's interesting, you come back to the comfort of your armchair and you page around through the book and you find that thing and you learn a little bit about it. And sometimes you might notice echoes of something odd in something that you're familiar with, and you wonder where that's coming from. So you can compare the two and see what kind of overlap there might be and why. And I have to say that when it comes to my own experience of eating and drinking, I've just become, as you can imagine, hypersensitized to the smells of the things I'm eating and drinking, the ambient smells, just kind of everything about it. It's something that I can easily turn off. You know, if I'm really enjoying something, then I can kind of notice that it's complicated, but then just enjoy it. And that's what I hope it'll do for people like followers of MOFAD who are mostly interested in food and drink, that it'll do the same kind of thing for you to help you in those moments of hypersensitivity to notice things that you wouldn't otherwise.
Just a personal question, because I told you I listened to your interview on Fresh Air, and I imagine a lot of people have. And you talked about that specific experience of eating the grouse and how profound and like overwhelming it was for you, just sensorily. Were you already researching the book when you had that experience, and was it so heightened, do you think, because you were sort of in the midst of that, or did that predate your research?
No, in fact, it was a trigger for the research. So I was interested in food, but I was in the UK, which is really the only place you can get grouse reliably, during grouse season, because I was touring in European cities to see what the culinary avant-garde were doing. I hadn't been to El Bulli before, and I hadn't been to Can Roca before. And so I was going for the first time to these places where the chefs were trying to knock my socks off, and, you know, make a really memorable experience. And the irony of the whole thing was that this very last meal that I had on that trip was a totally traditional English lunch, and it knocked my socks off in a way that none of the other meals did. So it was really the power of that experience that really focused my attention on flavor and on aroma in particular, because that's really what stuck with me. And uh, I should also mention that at the end of the book, I tell the story of having my second grouse at St. John, which I was looking forward to with great anticipation, thinking I was going to have my socks knocked off again, and I didn't. And I talk about why that is, but it's just, you know, it opens a dimension of experience that I think is just endless. You know, you can have your socks knocked off, you can expect to have them knocked off and not have them knocked off, whatever the experience is, there's something interesting to learn about the things in the world that you're interested in, and the way that you as an individual are perceiving things.
Yeah. Okay. In the book, you remind us of the importance of first even noticing the osmocosm as an initial step to engaging more deeply. Have you found yourself adopting a particular personal ritual or way of engaging when you want to listen and smell? Are there other experiments or approaches or training that you would recommend to people who would like to expand their olfactory perception?
Yeah, and in fact, there's a follow-up question or a related question that comes up about the Japanese practice of incense smelling.
That's
Uh,
what Kodo is?
yeah, uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called kodo or monko, and I've had the chance to experience that in Japan, and it's this amazing. It's like the tea ceremony, but for incense. So you sit down with a small number of people and you pay very close attention to the smallest details of, in this case, incense rather than tea. And they have this wonderful little device, which I won't describe, but you can see pictures of it, um, that heats the piece of incense wood without burning it. So you don't get smoke, you get the aroma of the incense wood. And you sit there and you pay attention and you turn your head and take a breath of fresh air and then come back and get another whiff. And then you move on to another incense wood and you learn the differences and the subtleties of these different things. So the cool thing about that practice is that it's, well, many cool things, but one of them is that the best English translation for it is listening to smells. And so it's the difference between hearing a sound and listening to it, paying attention to it, getting something out of it. We don't have a good word in the category of smelling, so listening to smells, I think, is just a nice, odd way of describing what I try to do all the time and what I recommend. And I don't really do that kind of thing every day in everyday experience. But if, for example, I'm learning about tobacco, which again, I knew nothing about because, tobacco is not something that we're supposed to be interested in these days, but it turns out that it's a really interesting natural material, natural and modified by human beings. Perfumers use it all the time because it is so interesting. They don't smoke it, but they use it in their fragrances. And so paying attention to that thing, ordering some online, opening the pouch and taking a deep whiff and really paying attention, that was fascinating. So I think it's something very simple that you can do anytime on the spur of the moment, whenever you think of it.
I love that concept, and I love how deeply, deeply Japanese it is, and how it could never be translated because there's no context for that, like in American culture. Okay, for you personally, what would you consider the strangest and or most precious smells you encountered in your research? And what new smell would you recommend we seek out?
Okay, so of course, those are very difficult questions because there are so many strange things out there and beautiful things out there. I have to say, um, I, I learned about many things that I would never have learned about had I not decided to read to learn about this. And so, in the case of the most wonderful smell, I guess I would have to pick something called agar wood or oud, which is an incense wood. It's very rare. It comes from Southeast Asia. The natural history of it is very interesting. It's actually produced in a tree when the tree is infected by a fungus. So it's a defensive mechanism on the part of the tree. And I first smelled it, in fact, in the Japanese ceremony, and was just amazed at the layers of smell in it. So I mentioned that in the book. When it comes to the strangest, I don't know. Um, Durian is pretty strange. The fruit durian. We have another question about that later. Surströmming, which is a fermented Herring is pretty off-putting to begin with. And then there's the interesting thing about surströmming and about the next thing I'm going to mention is that they're made intentionally to smell as overwhelming as they are. And that, I think, says something very interesting about human beings as sensory creatures. So we go out of our way sometimes to make things really stinky. Surströmming, this canned herring, is one of them. There's also something that's easier to get your hands on, which is baijiu, which is Chinese distilled alcohol, some versions of which are made in pits that are essentially dug into the ground and are left as mud. So the materials that are going to be fermented are put into these bare mud pits, and the microbes living in the mud go to town and leave their imprint on the distilled alcohol, and it's something. I had the chance to go to China to see this being done and to kind of, sniff around the mud pits and the fermentation chambers and so on. And it's, again, just a fascinating window onto the human psyche and, the trouble we'll go to be stimulated. So I
Yeah.
recommend searching out baijiu.
We did a baijiu program last year, but I don't think we got any of that particular kind of baijiu because I did not have a very intense reaction to it. I thought it was pretty good.
Well, you have to, there are like a dozen different aroma versions of baijiu. It's a bit like calling whiskey and cognac and, apple brandy all the same thing.
Right. It's like a category.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's really
So
interesting. I
anyway,
mean, but I wonder about things like durian, that are so obviously kind of divisive in their smell, how it does affect, your taste perception, and how I think some people are kind of attracted to durian and even maybe some stinky cheeses because, it's almost like a challenge, like to see if they can enjoy the taste, even though they know the smell is going to be so off-putting, like to see if they can kind of like separate that sensorially for themselves.
yeah, I think there's some of that. I think there's also kind of the, the roller coaster ride. You're going to be scared out of your wits, but it's safe. And
Right. Yeah.
that's
You
what
want to do
makes
it
it
anyway.
fun. So
Yeah.
you can smell something rotten smelling, but it's not rotten. And so it's okay to have the experience.
It probably won't kill you.
Right.
Well, kind of as a follow-up to this, someone said that they heard about a certain pharaoh was buried with a peppercorn in each nostril. What scent would you wish to smell for all eternity? That's a great question.
Well, I'm not sure the Pharaoh would have chosen peppercorns. I think I'd be sneezing through all of eternity if that were the case. I would have to go with this incense wood, agarwood, or frankincense, which is also amazing when you get to smell the thing itself and not a version of it. Yeah, something like that has a sort of otherworldliness to it, and since I figure I'm not going to be in this world, that seems appropriate.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so the next category is really more about memory and association and culture. So someone said that a lot of their intense memories are triggered by smell. Is that something that is widely experienced or researched? And someone else, the same. Their most vivid memories are triggered by smells. Why might this be the case?
Yeah, so this is an aspect of smell that I intentionally avoided writing about in the book. Because it has to do with subjectivity and with cultural differences. And what I really wanted to do was focus on the objective as much as possible. So regardless of what emotions things might evoke, or whether we can actually smell something or not smell something, or the reaction we have, positive or negative, all of that has to do with us as biological organisms, and we're all different, so we're all going to have somewhat different experiences. What I wanted to do was to give a field guide to what's out there. So whether or not we actually notice it on a particular occasion, whether we like it or don't like it. All those things to me are fascinating, and we're learning more and more about them as we learn more and more about how the brain works. But they're outside the purview of the book, which just tries to give a guide to what is out there. And just very, very briefly, because I didn't focus on it in the research for the book, the sense of smell is the one sense that does go directly to the most primitive part of the brain, where kind of automatic, rapid responses to perceptions take place, the amygdala. So it's where fight and flight responses originate, and it kind of makes sense that all this would be the case because, we enjoy smells precisely because they're not a matter of life and death. But if you imagine us as organisms evolving, it would have been very important not so much to identify smells, but to know immediately what to do when a particular one came into our nose. And so that's why that wiring is very direct. We don't have to do any thinking about it. We have a kind of automatic response. At this stage of our evolution, we tried to work with that, maybe even sometimes work around it. In the case of those rotting smells, tell our brain, it's okay. I understand that you're upset. You don't want to, you don't want me to put this in my mouth, but it's really interesting to me for other reasons. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. Two parts of our brain warring against each other. So it is fascinating. It is culturally relative, and lots of people are looking into that aspect of smell now, and we're learning a lot.
Yeah, and someone did ask specifically about the influence of culture on scent recognition. I think you just answered that question. Is there anything else that you wanted to say about it?
Well, another question that's kind of related had to do with language, and whether because we don't have such a great language for smells, we refer to smells not by naming them, but by naming the things that we associate them with. So hydrogen sulfide, we don't call hydrogen sulfide unless we're chemists. We say that eggy smell. And it turns out for a long time it was thought, well, that is just the way the human brain works. We don't have a linguistic attachment to that particular sense. And so we can't really give particular smells particular names that are not anchored in what we experience them in. But it turns out that there seem to be other cultures where there is that kind of use of language. And I wanted to mention the name of a particular researcher who has worked a lot on this subject in Southeast Asia. And if you're interested in this question, take a look at her work. Her name is Asifa Majid. That's spelled Asifa Majid. And maybe we can post something somewhere or other so that people can see that. But yeah, it's an area of active research, trying to understand how it is that the brain makes sense of smells, and how it is that some people are able to make such close distinctions among different smells, and how the brain manages to do that, even though that's not the way we were designed.
Great. This next one I feel like is the $1,000,000 question. Why do some people interpret flavor molecules differently? For example, cilantro versus soap.
Yeah, and that has to do with our differences biologically and experientially. So first of all, there are receptors in our nose. We have about 400 olfactory receptors. They're what respond to the molecules coming out of the cilantro or coming out of the soap. And the smells that come out of cilantro and soap are like chords rather than like notes. So they're made up of many different components. Soaps and cilantro have some of those components in common. And so some of us are especially sensitive to that crossover, and may get more the soapy smell than the green, fresh herbal smell, in which case we're going to be inclined not to like it so much. And that sensitivity has to do not only with the receptors, but also with our experience, what our brain has taken on as data from past experiences of tastes and smells. And so, for example, if you grow up with cilantro every day from being a child, you know it, you know that aroma, that smell as that particular herb. But if you only encounter it for the first time as a young adult, and it's in an ethnic restaurant, and it's strange for all kinds of reasons, then you're going to respond very differently. And it's possible with repeated exposure and exposure under different conditions to learn a different response to it, but it'll take some work to get there.
So it's not an allergy.
No, no.
So if you think it tastes like soap, you're wrong. Learn how it tastes delicious.
No, they're not wrong. They're just their brain is categorizing it in a certain way that makes total sense based on their experience. So
No,
what they
I'm just kidding.
need to
I know you're
do
not
is
wrong, but your brain is rebelling against you.
exactly. So all you have to do is have more experience, eat more cilantro.
It's delicious, I promise. Okay, someone is really interested to learn how culture and landscape play a part in olfactory experiences. Is there a difference between rural and urban experiences of the same ingredients? What about Western versus Asian palates?
Yeah, and that kind of falls into the same category of things that I really didn't dig into. There are studies that I'm aware of that will, for example, give people from different countries all over the world the same set of things to taste or smell, and then record their responses. And as you would imagine, they're very, very different depending on the culture they come from. So, you know, the smell of cilantro is perfectly well accepted in many places, not so much others. The smell of natto, fermented soybeans in Japan, not so popular in Asia, in Europe and North America. So it really does depend a lot, again, on your experience, which is determined by the culture you grow up in. When it comes to rural versus urban, I'm not really sure. You know, the ambient smells will be different in those two places, and that might affect the way that you appreciate a particular thing that you experience. But I'm not aware of any studies of that particular divide.
Great. And just a quick thing, some of you have written a question or two in the chat, which is fine. We're going to go through these questions that were sent ahead of time. And if we have time after, we'll try and go back to questions that are in the chat. So feel free to type them in there as they come up. I just can't promise. It's just, we'll see how we're doing time-wise. But Harold he's plowing through these. Okay. These are the specific smell categories. Regarding the topic you mentioned last week about smells of the skin and organisms digesting the human skin, is this related to why fabrics with certain fiber contents make us smell different ways? For example, polyester versus wool.
Yes, that's a very good point. So it turns out that the human body emits various volatile molecules because we have these microbes living on us and in us, and breaking down our skin fatty acids and our skin proteins and making fragments small enough that they can fly through the air and into our nose, and that's what makes us smell. So different fabrics do indeed have different affinities for these kinds of molecules, and so they will pick up or retain or release different classes of molecules differently depending on which material it is. A good example is wool, which has its own very distinctive smell, which seems to reappear even when it's been washed enough times that you'd think you'd probably gotten rid of most of the vestiges of that kind of lanolin sheepy quality. But it's just very, very good at hanging on to aroma molecules and then releasing them actually only under certain circumstances. And this is one of the reasons why perspiration can be a problem, not only in and of itself, but because of the effect that it has on fabrics and the fabric's ability to hang on to volatiles. So it turns out that when wool, which has glommed onto a bunch of volatile molecules, either from the sheep or from the human being who's wearing it, when the wool gloms onto those molecules, they're held on the surface and in pores in the proteins that make up the wool fiber. When that fiber is wetted by the rain or by perspiration or whatever, that water actually gets into the pores of the wool fiber and forces the volatile molecules out and into the air. So things that were kind of in there hiding get pushed out by the wetting up of the fiber. And that's why that well, wet animal aroma.
Wet dog smell.
Yes, exactly.
Of
Wet
course.
dog, well, wet wool, all those things. So that's what's going on. And I can't cite you chapter and verse about, polyester versus wool versus cotton. It has a lot to do as well with the way these fabrics are treated. They're treated so that you don't have to iron them or this reason or that reason. They've got dyes and so on. So it gets complicated. But bottom line is that there is a connection between what you wear and what you smell like.
And my Shih Tzu. All makes sense now. Okay. If H2S is a normal egg smell, what's the chemicals of a rotten egg smell?
Good question. And that's something that I looked for very early on in this project and was happy to find the answers. So hydrogen sulfide is the smell of cooked eggs. So if you take a raw egg and you boil it, and then you smell it right after you've boiled it, that smell is hydrogen sulfide predominantly. Again, all of these things are chords rather than notes, but it's predominantly hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is a really volatile molecule. It's very small, just 3 atoms. And so if you let that egg sit on the countertop for a few hours, its smell will diminish a great deal. And if you let it sit in the fridge for a few days, you can barely tell it's an egg. So that hydrogen sulfide is really the smell of a freshly cooked egg. When an egg is rotted, then what takes over is something called methane thiol, another primitive molecule that's also found in outer space, but it's not hydrogen sulfide. It's a little more complicated. It's got a carbon atom attached to it. And that's the smell of rotting vegetables, rotting eggs, rotting all kinds of things. So hydrogen sulfide will be, again, in the chord of rotten egg smell, but the dominant note in rotten egg smell is methane thiol.
Have you ever visited the Dead Sea in Israel?
I have not, no.
Oh, that's so interesting. I just assumed you'd been there. It smells like rotting egg from like the worst rotting egg smell you've ever smelled, like from miles away. Which I always just assumed was the high levels of sulfur in the water.
That's an interesting question. Offhand, I don't know. I mean, the Red Sea, it does. Sea. Dead Sea, I'm sorry.
The one with all the salt.
Right, yes.
So much salt that you can float.
Yes. So even though there's a ton of salt in it, there are many, many different microbes that can live in those conditions. They've adapted to those conditions. And my guess is that what you're smelling is their metabolism. There's not much else in there to work with. And if the area is rich in sulfur deposits, then those microbes are certainly going to use that sulfur to help power their cellular engines. So that's my guess, but I don't know it for sure.
Well, one day when there's no longer a pandemic and you go to Israel, you let me know.
All right.
Okay. What is the mechanism by which the warm, buttery smell of the washed rind of the cheese turns into a rather pungent ammonia aroma?
Yes, so this is an example of human beings going to crazy lengths to make unpleasant smells. So you're right. If you take a freshly made cheese, it's got a very mild aroma. And the way you make stinky cheeses is to take that wonderfully mild cheese and bathe it every day in the cheese equivalent of sweat, which is to say a salt solution, which usually has lots of microbes in it from the last batch of cheeses. So you keep the surface of the cheese moist, kind of like our underarms or like feet that have been in shoes for too long, and you end up getting similar microbes doing similar things, which is to say breaking down the animal molecules, proteins and fats, into smaller molecules that they can then use for food and for energy. And so you end up with very, very similar smells in those two conditions. So it's something that human beings go to great trouble to generate, washing these cheeses every day or two to make sure that those microbes stay happy and stinky.
That's so odd. Okay. Apple seeds also remind me of amaretto cookies. And I remember those are made from apricot kernels. Is there a relation?
Yeah, so we talked last time about, and actually had people who were willing to bite into a few apple seeds to see what they tasted like. And in addition to tasting bitter, they have a bitter almond or almond extract aroma. And that's absolutely right. Amaretto and um, let's see, marzipan, and there are just many, many different uh, dishes coming from the Middle East and Eastern Europe, where the almond tree grows naturally and where many almond trees have vestiges of that bitterness that we talked about last time that turns out to be toxic, which is why we have the separation of almond flavor from almonds themselves. But yeah, all those things are related. The um, plums, cherries, apricots, apples, pears, they're all in the same family, and they all defend their seeds with the same warning molecule that we smell, and then cyanide, which is the toxin.
Right. Just going back to that very intentional washing the rind to make it smell a certain way. I mean, is that related to kind of what we were speaking about before, like making things kind of offensive smelling as like a way to kind of attract people, or is there sort of like an animalistic quality inside of us that's drawn to these very kind of like base smells?
Yeah, so of course this is speculation and not anything that I could prove, but I have a theory, which is that if you ask the question, and that's one of the things that kind of got me to write the book in the first place, if you ask the question when there are different things in the world that echo each other's smells, which came first, which was the original and which others are the kind of imitations or the Johnny come latelys. So when it comes to, for example, the smells of washed rind cheeses, human beings would have encountered those smells first and foremost on themselves. And then at some point, they're learning how to make cheeses, which is taking milk from an animal that is not a human being and doing things to it to make it last so that it doesn't spoil right away. And then you have to find ways to make it palatable. Well, maybe one way to make something as strange initially as the coagulated milk of a cow more familiar is to make it smell a little bit like yourself, to make it reminiscent of yourself. So in my imagination, it would not have been off-putting to the first people to investigate this kind of thing. It would have actually been of interest and attractive and appealing. And, maybe for different reasons back then, but we still have it in us to find it appealing and interesting and attractive. And so, maybe it is something a little bit atavistic. But the fact that these cheeses are still made and beloved by enough people to keep them in business, there's something there.
Yes. Okay, I like that theory. How do chilies fit into the plant world in terms of attracting predators to distribute their seeds? If an herb like mint is flavorsome to a human, but completely overwhelming to a caterpillar due to scale, where does chili fit?
So chilies are really interesting because the material that repels animals is the pungent stuff, the hot pepper molecule, capsaicin. And the capsaicin is not in the fruit itself. It's actually right around the seeds and the tissues that support the seeds on the inside of the fruit. And so a wonderful scientist by the name of Gary Nabhan figured this out back in the 1970s, and he's still going strong at, I think, the University of New Mexico, went out into the Sonoran Desert and began to look at the natural history of chili peppers in the wild. And what he found was that birds have no trouble with capsaicin because they just eat the outer fruit and kind of spit out the seeds and or defecate them as they're flying. And they're not at all sensitive to capsaicin. If you give them feed laced with capsaicin, they have no problem with it whatsoever. Mammals have a terrible time with it, and mammals chew things. So the rodents that live in that part of the Sonoran Desert won't touch chili peppers because the moment they bite in, they're going to get that capsaicin, which they're very sensitive to, and so it repels them. So it turns out to be a great system because it prevents rodents from chewing up the seeds and destroying the plant's ability to survive. And it rewards the long distance delivery service, the birds, which can fly miles and miles and miles before they defecate the seeds. And the seeds end up, landing somewhere in a pile of manure ready to take off.
That is amazing. Okay, here's that durian question. What about the Asian fruit durian? What does create its very intense pungency?
So durian is something that I went on a field trip to to experience and to understand. And I could talk about it for a long time, but I'll reduce it to this. Scientists in Germany, flavor scientists, ask the question, how can you reduce the essential aroma of durian to its smallest number of components? And they found that they could get people in Asia to smell something and say, that's the smell of durian, with just two molecules. One of them is the molecule that helps give strawberry its wonderfully berry-like, strawberry-ish sweet smell. And the other, the sulfur compound that's most commonly found in onions and cooked onions, and sometimes garlic as well. So it's the combination of a fruit and onions or garlic, that kind of sulfurous stuff. So when you read descriptions of durian, you'll find all kinds of horrific descriptors, just the worst possible associations you can imagine. And what I'm wondering, because this information from Germany is relatively recent, I'm wondering whether those same people, when presented with those two molecules, would have the same response, or whether because the initial effect is so weird, fruit plus onion, that they people generally are just off put by that dissonance and then come up with all kinds of associations that actually aren't there in those two molecules. So I think that remains to be seen. I ended up really loving durian. So, but again, it's a very personal thing.
That makes so much sense to me. Like when you said the fruit and the onion, I was like, finally, I have a way to wrap my mind around what durian smells like. Huh. Okay. And I agree. I think it's really delicious. Um, my favorite question, what makes cat poop in coffee have a similar smell?
Okay. Well, I have to make a slight correction. I'm not aware actually of any good studies of cat poop, but cat pee has been very well studied for reasons that I explain in the book. And it turns out that, of course, cats use their urine as a marking material to mark out territory and to communicate with each other. And it turns out that one of the molecules that is in that cocktail of signals in cat urine is identical to one of the molecules that's generated when you roast coffee beans. And they're both sulfur molecules, and it's sulfur that makes durian smell as strange as it does, and it's hydrogen sulfide and methane thiol that make eggs and rotten eggs smell the way they do. So you can see there's kind of a theme going on here, that sulfur atoms in a molecule will give it some kind of resonance for us that's not purely pleasant. And so that's the case with these molecules in cat pee and in coffee, and also in roast meats. Now, when you smell those molecules by themselves or in the context of meat or coffee, they smell meaty or like coffee. When you smell them in the context of cat urine, they smell like cat urine. So, but the molecule itself is the same. It's the context that changes.
I've also read, because I've definitely never smelled it myself, but when crystal meth is being cooked, it smells like cat pee. Did you come across that in your research?
No, I did not. I'll look into that.
Again, not personal experience. Just read a book. Read a book. Okay. Someone has been reading The Dorito Effect by Mark Schatzker, and he discusses the ability of animals to use flavor and smell to perceive nutrition in their foods. Has your research into smell found any interesting insights into how this works and how it may be manipulated in humans by industrial food when natural smells are replaced by artificial ones? That's a great question.
Yeah, yeah. And that's, again, something that I really don't address in the book directly. But what I would say is that, the foods that we've learned to eat in the world, we learn to eat as is, or we would cook them to make them more palatable. So it's working with the materials that are available to us. Once we learned enough about flavor to begin to concoct things on our own without any actual foods, then the balance kind of got skewed, because now, instead of foods being out there and we kind of take them for what they are, now foods are being kind of targeted at our desires to get us to eat as much as possible, to make as much money as possible. So, the situation has changed completely when it comes to industrially manufactured foods. And that's a big part of why we find ourselves with the public health problems that we have today. But a related question to that is, what about making distinctions between natural and artificial flavors? And here I wish Nadia was with us, because she's brilliant at talking about this. And I would just give one example. along the way to saying that it's not an easy distinction to make, because nature may make a molecule for its reasons. Human beings may make exactly the same molecule for our reasons. I don't see that one is morally superior to the other. I think it's a question of what are the purposes to which those molecules being put. So, for example, uh, the key aroma compound in vanilla is a molecule called vanillin. We learned how to make vanillin without any vanilla plants in the 19th century, long, long time ago. We now consume in the world, I don't know, it's probably tens to hundreds of thousands of times more vanilla flavor than the plants that actually produce vanilla pods would be able to supply. So there would be kind of two alternatives. Either if we didn't have the artificial vanilla, either people would love vanilla, but it would be like saffron. It would be a spice that no one could really afford, and so no one could really have. Or people would just go and harvest vanilla and plant it wherever, and the landscape would be devastated, and there would be consequences for the ecosystems, which are all tropical, and for the people who live there. And we've seen all kinds of problems with chocolate and that kind of those kinds of incentives. So I think it would actually be a real mess if we didn't have artificial vanilla flavor to satisfy that demand. And conversely, you can imagine people using natural vanilla to do exactly the same kind of hunger manipulation and sensory manipulation as they use artificial vanilla to do. So what's important is the purpose to which these things are put, and not how they're made.
Which really gets into like an entire other, ethical conversation about like GMOs and hunger, and like that is a real slippery slope. And the follow-up question is the word natural problematic?
Yeah, and I guess I would say well, you use the word slippery, so I think that's a good term to apply to a word like natural, because vanillin, for example, was originally made by plants, but it's also made when you burn things. If you use hickory chips to smoke your barbecue, well, one of the reasons the smell is so wonderful is that there's vanillin, that same molecule in there, and that's made by burning organic material. And then human beings can make the same molecule starting with wood pulp, or just all kinds of other ingredients. So it's natural in vanilla, that's pretty clear. I guess it's natural in burning wood, because wood burns without human beings getting involved. So why is it any different if somebody's making it from wood pulp without the agency of fire? So it's slippery.
Well, now I know that the old school cheese people have been manipulating our cheese to make it stinky, so I trust nobody. Okay. So final category: taste, smell, flavor, etc. Would you agree that taste plus aroma equals flavor? Does taste contribute to smell? Does taste ever interfere with smell?
Wonderful question. And again, Nadia would be a spectacular speaker to this effect, that flavor is, as the saying goes these days in the sensory field, multimodal or multisensory. So it's mostly taste and smell, taste on the tongue, smell in the nose, but it's also sensation, um, um, feeling, touch, the texture of a food. Capsaicin, the irritation, is actually a touch sensation. Temperature makes a difference. The sound of a food as we're eating it makes a difference to our perception of it. Wonderful experiments to do with crispness and how you can fool people to think they're eating something crisp by changing the sounds that are going on around you. So it's really this experience that human beings encounter every day, where almost every sense is operating at the same time. And of course, vision, seeing before we eat, eating with our eyes, and so on. So all of these things participate, and all of these things affect the overall experience. So you can get people to think that something is crisp when it's not by changing the sounds. And the question was about whether taste can affect smell. And the answer is absolutely yes, and vice versa. You can make things taste more intensely sweet by adding something like vanilla that we associate with sweet things. You can make something taste more savory by adding a little bit more salt, because we associate salty things with meaty aromas. So yes, and flavor chemists and food scientists are working with all of these elements all at once, playing with the different components to, again, try to make something that really appeals to us.
And I imagine when you lost your smell, things tasted a lot less vibrant, you know, than they do now that it's been restored.
Yeah, exactly. It was, I first noticed it drinking a cup of coffee, and the coffee was bitter and astringent and hot, and that's it. And if that's all coffee is, it's not very pleasant.
Yeah, it's like experiencing life in black and white all of a sudden, I bet. Okay, for a period of time, I saw a lot of attention given to the idea that European cuisines preferred ingredient combinations that had a lot of overlap in flavor chemicals, and East Asian ones preferred ingredient combinations without the overlap. Does this align with your experience in both the science of cooking and the science of flavor? Do any examples come to mind that contradict this theory?
All right, so I'm very glad someone asked that question, because that's a theory that has gotten a lot of attention, and I think it's completely mistaken. And certainly the evidence that's been put forth in favor of it is really faulty. And it's kind of amazing to me that this hasn't been pointed out by people who study this kind of thing. So basically, these ideas came from um, scraping online databases of recipes automatically, and then correlating recipe ingredients with the molecules that are involved in generating their flavors. So the studies were basically taking two different data sets. One data set was recipes from online, and the other data set was composition information, what's in foods, also online. And they were limited, of course, to online sources, because that's the only way you can do that kind of thing efficiently. And bottom line, there's a saying in computers and probably lots of other things: garbage in, garbage out. So if your databases are faulty or highly selective or not representative, then the results you get, no matter how cool they look in a graphic, are just kind of meaningless. And so, for example, the data that purported to show that European traditions rely on flavor matching and Asian traditions rely on flavor oppositions. Well, if you look at the recipes and the major components in the European recipes, they're flour, sugar, milk, butter. In other words, they stumbled on a database that was all about baking. You know, there's just no variation. Whereas the Asian recipes, Asians don't make a lot of baked goods, and so of course they're going to get a different set of a different cross section of recipes, and it's going to look very different. So, bottom line, I think there aren't any kind of general principles involved across cultures in how people choose what goes together and what doesn't go together. It's really a matter of what's available in that area and the traditions that develop using those materials.
Makes sense. Okay, can you talk a little bit about optimal smelling environments? I assume the best environment for smelling something is context sensitive, but was curious if you ran across any situations where the environment something is smelled in is particularly suited to the activity.
Yeah, and that's again a tricky kind of thing because when we sense smells in the environment, we're breathing in, right? We're inhaling and getting molecules from outside. When we're eating or drinking, we get those sensations when we breathe out. So the food is in our mouth, and we pass the food, the aromas of the food through our nose on the breath out. And those are two very different procedures, and the brain treats them totally differently. So you can do the experiment sometime of, well, and in fact, stinky cheeses are a great example. You can smell a stinky cheese from 50 feet away in a room, right? You then put a bite in your mouth, and it's surprisingly mild. It doesn't have that same, and you would think that because it's now in your mouth, it's just going to blow out your smell sensors. In fact, it's the smell is much reduced, and that's because the brain has different pathways for dealing with stuff that's in the environment and stuff that's in our mouth. And so when we talk about finding an environment or making an environment that's particularly suitable for a particular flavor, we're talking about an influence of something outside us that we're not actually experiencing when we eat. It's kind of there for the breath beforehand, but it's not there when we're actually experiencing it. And that, I think, has a lot to do, again, with the individual, and how much you can kind of remember, for example, that I'm sitting next to a rosemary bush and I'm having a piece of meat that hasn't been cooked with rosemary, but that aroma is in the air. How much of that carries over, I think, has a lot to do with how much that person's brain is kind of integrating stuff that's happening just before taking the bite with the actual eating process. And I think that's just not predictable.
Yeah, I mean, I had that same experience when I tasted durian back again for the first time. I mean, I remember, just being so surprised that it was mild and pleasant. And I still think of it as having this kind of like lingering oniony flavor, but I think that's really just remembering what it smells like.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, last question. This is from the perspective of an educator who's working with elementary school age kids without access to actual food samples. Can you recommend any fun or interesting ways to explain the synergy of smells from different foods to children? Like, for example, how to create exciting combinations that help food taste better.
Okay, so I wanted to end with this question because I think it's slightly rephrased, a great question for all of us to ask. And it's not that I think that there are flavor combinations that are out there that have not been discovered to make things taste better, because good, better, bad, though these are all, again, subjective impressions and not something that we can really be prescriptive about. But I think it really is true that there are so many opportunities all the time, every day, for us to pay attention to what's there and to enjoy what's there. We're animals and we have these animal senses, and it's a shame that for a long time and for much of our daily lives, we kind of ignore what's coming in through the nose. So it turns out that there are some really wonderful programs, a couple of them in England, actually, that are aimed at getting children to pay more attention to smells, mostly by way of food and drink. And so I found a few websites that we, again, can maybe give people on the website or somehow or other. But there are two in the UK. And then here in the US, Alice Waters' Edible Schoolyard has a curriculum, and something called Charlie Cart, Charlie, CART. Has, again, a wonderful curriculum that's designed specifically for schools, and the person who asked the question is an educator. But I think it goes beyond that. I think, just, again, paying more attention and enjoying the everyday just has a lot to offer all of us.
That is a wonderful note to end on. I think, we always say now more than ever because of the pandemic, but I mean, seriously, now more than ever, just being appreciative of the little things that we have, including, the smells around us and in our home. That rings true. We are at time, so I'm sorry we didn't get to the rest of the questions in the chat, and that we don't have time for more cat pee conversations, although I wish we did because it's really fun. But Harold, thank you so much for spending this extra hour, this bonus time with us. This was really, really wonderful. I'm so grateful I got to have this conversation with you. Yeah, it was amazing. You're such a delight. I hope we get to do more programs soon. It would be wonderful to have you and Nadia back together. And I hope you don't have to do any more Zooms today and you get some rest.
8 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Okay. We'll definitely get some rest. Thank you again. Okay. If you haven't bought Nosedive, you have to get it now. This was fantastic. All right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.